I saw something.
Okay, well, hopefully it's recording. Okay, well, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And so honored, we have our returning champion, Dimitri Lascaris, who was a Real News Network correspondent and who was a Real News Network correspondent on environmental affairs in Canada. He is a member and co-founder of Green Left Canada, a member of Disruption Canada, a brilliant protest group, a people power protest group. He's an environmentalist, an anti-imperialist, an eco-socialist, a racial, social, and eco-justice campaigner, and a lawyer. And although I normally have Dimitri on to talk about all things Canada, we're actually going to switch it up a bit and talk about European affairs, particularly the state of the green left, Greece, and France. So I'm really looking forward to it. So first off, Dimitri, thank you so much for coming back on the program. It's an honor to have you back.
Thank you, Youri. Always a pleasure to be here, and you're too kind with those words. Thank you.
Oh, you deserve it, you compassionate gentleman. And so yes, and actually, Dimitri, before I get to the first question, you're actually not in Canada right now, but you're actually in you're actually in Greece right now. So what's going on? You like have you completely moved out of Canada what's going on with that? Because many people are worried. Is Dimitri not going to be part? If Dimitri's not in Canada, who else? Like we need him.
Oh, there's lots of people doing good work in Canada. They're just being silenced by the mainstream media, unfortunately. But I've not abandoned Canada. I split my time now between Greece and Canada. My parents were born and raised in Greece. I'm a Greek citizen. And, when I finally found myself in a position to, retire, or at least semi-retire from the practice of law, I had the opportunity to come back in Greece. And so now I have a house in the southern coast of Greece, and I spend about half the year here.
Okay, well, in the future, I'm still based in Belgium, so you gotta come. So you gotta come visit here, or even better, I gotta come visit you in Greece. So,
as you well know, Youri, it's somewhat warmer here than in Belgium. So.
Exactly. So, Dimitri, so the first question I'd like to ask you, and let's not spend too much time on this because I really want to talk about what's happening in Greece and France, but the first question I wanted to ask you is, what is the current state of the Green Left movement and its role or lack thereof when it comes to anti-imperialism and understanding that you can't be an environmentalist or an eco-socialist and support any kind of militarism, whether that's NATO membership or the pivot to Asia? And I asked this question, and before you answer, I asked this question because we talked about this last time, how horrendous the German Green Party is. Of course, it has a history, like the NDP, of sort of co-opting the left and then kneecapping its people power movement. But you see, but you have the German Green Party, which is just atrocious. I don't even know how you can even call them a Green Party at this state. Of course, back in Canada, we don't have, it's not people like Alex Tyrell, the Miriam Haddads, and people like you that are controlling the Green Party. It's the people who still believe in eco-capitalism, which I think is an oxymoron, and they're not serious when it comes to anti-imperialist issues. And then we look at throughout the continent of Europe, and maybe I'm generalizing too much, but we have green parties, in Australia, New Zealand, and across the continent of Europe, and yes, they might attack, the traditional center-left parties from the left at times, and they might have policies which are much better than the mainstream parties, whether they're the center-right, the far-right, or the center-left. But when it comes to peace, when it comes to anti-imperialism, they usually they're all gung ho when it comes to NATO. They're NATO socialists, if that's even and they support the pivot to Asia. So I'm curious. So yeah, I'm curious your response to that. The state of the green, the green left movement and its relation to peace and building a nonviolent world.
Well, I just want to. I think I should start in answering your question. Start by addressing your use of the term green left. Green left is I would say the best way to describe it is as a constituency within the global green movement. The global green movement also includes eco-capitalists, whom you mentioned, and it includes people who try to straddle the fence between these two poles. So, there is a lot of shall we say, tension between those different constituencies within the global green movement. It's important to understand that, the global green movement, and it is a global movement, there's an international Greens Charter, and all the green parties, there's green parties all over the world, not necessarily in every country, but in many countries, certainly, I think virtually every country in the West and other non-Western countries. And as far as I know, they all subscribe to the same 6 core values, which are nonviolence, respect for diversity, sustainability, ecological wisdom, social justice, and one other one which escapes me. But these sort of broad principles leave a lot of room for interpretation. When the Green Party was born in Germany, and when it was born, one of the founders of the Green Party in Germany and globally was somebody by the name of Petra Kelly. Petra Kelly was a true anti-imperialist. She was opposed to NATO. She was opposed to nuclear weapons. She was opposed to militarism. She was a feminist and could, I think, fairly be described as an eco-socialist. And that's where the German Green Party, that's where the global green movement and the German Green Party were born, out of that movement. But as we've seen, in not just within the green parties of the world, but also within the social democratic parties of the world, like the Labour Party in Britain, the Socialist Party in France, the Social Democrats in Germany, there has been a concerted attempt by people on the right to co-opt those parties. And certainly the Green Party, both within Germany and internationally, has not been immune from that struggle. And just as we've seen in the Labour parties and the Social Democratic parties of Europe, in the Democratic Party in the United States, the NDP in Canada, by and large, we have lost that struggle, those of us who are on the left wing of these parties. And our parties have been co-opted. And now we see this today in Germany in dramatic form. The German Green Party today is an abomination, to be perfectly blunt about it. I don't think there's, certainly when it comes to the principles of nonviolence and ecological wisdom, I think that they have completely lost the script and in fact represent a set of policies that are fundamentally hostile to ecological wisdom and particularly nonviolence. I think the best favor that the Green Party of Germany could do for the rest of the Green Parties of the world today is to change their name.
Exactly.
They're an absolute embarrassment. Annalena Baerbock, Robert Habeck. I want nothing to do with them. I think they're really they represent ultimately the demise of the global green movement. If we don't, those of us on the left of the global green movement don't succeed in dissociating ourselves from them, we're going to go the way of the dodo bird, and we'll have nothing to contribute to global politics very soon. And I personally am very, disheartened by this. I don't know. I've begun to question my own commitment to the Green Party because
back in Canada.
And for me, the kind of I would go so far as to say perhaps the final blow was when the current leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May, gave a press conference on January 30th in Ottawa, in which she was actually, she invoked the example of Annalena Baerbock and the German Green Party and suggested that they were, they represented a set of policies that we should be emulating in Canada. And for me, that was, I couldn't believe my ears. I mean, because they are, as I say, they are the antithesis of everything the Green Party was supposed to embody. So
And are,
I
and are many Greens, Greens are a lot of them just falling under that trend of society shifting to the right and having these imperial blind spots, and a lot of them just victims to also the propaganda system. But at the same time, I mean, I know you've talked about this a lot, Ben Norton, Max Blumenthal, Glenn Ford, the late Glenn Ford, but still the current team at Black Agenda Report and so many other outlets have also talked about how there is, not to use to use Margaret Thatcher's phrase, but there is an enemy. There is an enemy within the left movement. There are some leftists that do believe in war, that do believe in imperialism, who do subscribe to some kind of green capitalism. And do you think that just explains why so many of these green parties, however big or small they are, follow the kind the model of the Green Party of Canada, or certainly the Green Party of Germany?
Yeah, I mean, the mechanisms whereby we've been co-opted, I mean, it's an interesting subject and we can go on forever about that. But the fact is we have been co-opted. I don't think, the imperialist and capitalist elites are very adept at nullifying social movements and political movements, infiltrating them and corrupting them and propagandizing them to their own advantage, their own purposes. And we've seen that in the green parties of the world. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that other than that I myself am no longer convinced that the Green Party deserves my support, and I have to I'm kind of reevaluating that. I'm not sure that there's a lot of hope in electoral politics at all, and that the best contribution that I can make may at the end of the day be what you're trying to do, which is independent, hard-hitting, left-wing journalism of integrity. That may be
very
the best
much for that compliment.
Conversations. I mean, this is where journalism is today, right? It's your people like yourself, people all over YouTube, you citizen journalists all over YouTube, who free themselves of the constraints of, the capitalist class, who have refused to conduct the art of journalism within a large corporate context. That what they're doing is incredibly valuable, and that may be the best contribution we can make. The precursor to, the exercise of our democratic rights is informed consent. We have to be informed, and if we aren't informed, if we don't really understand what is happening in our world, we're not going to make the right choices at the ballot box. And right now, the majority of the population in the West is just extraordinarily misinformed about the state of our world.
Well, best of luck to the eco-socialist / eco-anti-imperialist movement in their efforts to, fight back against those green capitalists. And that's a perfect segue to this question. We talked about Greece, both off the air and on the air, and actually talk to us about the state of talk to us briefly about the state of Greek affairs, and then talk to us about the state of the Greek left and its anti-war, anti-imperial attitudes and mobilizations against these wars, like the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war and the pivot to Asia. Because now, and I'm curious, is the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement, if there is a big movement in Greece, is it stronger in Greece given the history of Greece when it comes to Greece being a victim of U.S. UK imperialism? And if not, why do you think it's and if the answer is no, why do you think that is?
Look, I think relative to most Europeans, Greeks are keenly conscious of the scourge of imperialism and capitalism. I mean, I could go all the way back to the Ottoman occupation, but let's start in the interest of brevity with the Second World War. Let's start there, because just for the interest of time. You know, Greece experienced one of the most brutal Nazi occupations of any country in Europe, and you know, the most effective resistance to the Nazi occupation in Greece were the communists. And when, because of the success, the relative success with which they resisted the Nazis, when Nazis were driven from Greece, the communists were the ones who were best positioned to take power. Now, the British struck a nefarious deal with Stalin at that time, you know, and Stalin essentially ceded to the British sphere of influence Greece, amongst other countries in the south of Europe.
Interesting.
And what the British then did, once they had sort of carte blanche to impose their will upon the Greeks, is that they fomented a civil war, you know, in order to prevent the rise of communism within Greece. They cobbled together a motley collection of monarchists, Nazi collaborators, and capitalists to wage war against the communist movement. And ultimately, after several years of devastating civil war, the right wing prevailed. And my parents lived through all of that in the south of Greece. They were born in the Depression in Greece. They lived through the Nazi occupation. They lived through the Civil War. In the 1950s, Greece lay in smoking ruins, and that's when they emigrated to Canada, and you know, that's where I was born. Some years after they left in the 1960s, you know, the left, because the left movement was never really crushed in Greece. It still was there. It still was quite vibrant. Yeah. There was, you know, from the perspective of the Americans, who at that point kind of supplanted, you know, the British as the world's preeminent imperialist power. There was a concern that a leftward government would come to Greece in the 1960s. And so what did they do? They orchestrated a coup d'etat, which installed in power a Nazi collaborator from the Second World War by the name of George Papadopoulos, who was a CIA agent and effectively imposed upon Greece's dictatorship for some 6 or 7 years, a brutal repressive dictatorship. And he was overthrown in the 70s. And then, you know, what I would regard as a moderately left-wing government came back into power during the 80s, a party by the name of PASOK. And then we fast forward to, you know, the financial crisis. You know, the sort of the center-right and the center-left traded power up until we get to the financial crisis of 2010. At that point, Greece still had a very vibrant and militant left. And I think that the European elite and the Americans, the IMF, saw in the financial crisis an opportunity to destroy the Greek left once and for all. And that's what they attempted to do. And to be frank about it, they've been quite successful, to be honest. The Greek left is still there. It hasn't given up, but it is, I would say, much less militant today than it has been at any time in the post-World War II period. And sort of the turning point, the really sort of catastrophic event for the Greek left was in 2015 when, you know, Syriza came to power, which many of us hoped, or at least regarded or hoped, was a true party of the radical left. And they put forward a program opposed to the austerity, you know, prescriptions of the European Commission and the European Central Bank and the IMF. And how did the troika of Greece's creditors, the ECB, the Commission, and the IMF respond? They basically told the Greece government that if you don't accept this latest round of austerity measures, which were harsher than any that had been imposed upon Greece up until that time, we're going to crash your financial system. And faced with that dilemma, Syriza, which had only been in power for a few months, decided to hold a referendum whether or not to accept the austerity measures. And despite the threats, I mean, effectively there was an economic gun pointed to the head of the Greek people. Amazingly, the Greek people voted, approximately 2/3 voted against the austerity package being demanded by the troika of Greek creditors. But within 24 hours, Greece's so-called radically left Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras effectively ignored the result of the referendum and decided to impose those austerity measures on Greece nonetheless. So it's been a very difficult time for the left in Greece since then. It was an extremely disheartening experience. But I must tell you, Youri, and sounds like a very all of the things that I'm saying about the Green Party and the Greek left may sound very discouraging. I personally, nonetheless, remain optimistic, and I'm convinced that the revolution will come, that we will overthrow the structures of capitalist and imperialist power in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And that when it happens, it's going to happen with a rapidity that will amaze us. We're just in our darkest hour, when we think there's no hope left, all of a sudden the house of cards will come crashing down, and we will see before us open up a world of opportunity. I don't know when that moment's going to come. I hope it happens in my lifetime. And it might. It could happen in my lifetime, but it will come. It's just right now is a particularly difficult moment, I think, for the left in Greece, and more broadly for the left in Europe. And in a strange sort of way, this war in Ukraine could be, as tragic and as horrible as it is for the people of Ukraine. It's unspeakably horrible for the people of Ukraine, and has potentially, catastrophic consequences for all of humanity. If we play our cards right, this may be a point at which this may be a catalyst to the destruction of this capitalist and imperialist regime which has been foisted upon us, and an opportunity for us to start to rebuild Europe from the ground up.
Two quick follow-ups on Greece is number one is the austerity package, the shock doctrine that was imposed on Greece. Is Greece effectively still under austerity? Because I believe after Syriza was rightly punished, when Syriza was rightly punished, unfortunately, the left was very demoralized, and then I think the New Democracy, which is the traditional center-right party, came back into power. So is Greece still under is still going through endless cycle of austerity and whatnot, and all the misery that comes with austerity?
Absolutely. If you look at the minimum wage in Greece, it's not a living wage. It's way below what is necessary to have a decent life. The healthcare system has been eviscerated. A lot of people have been forced, adults, to go back and live with their parents, their pensioner parents, because they can't afford just to pay the basic cost of living. Austerity has not gone anywhere in this country. And despite austerity, I mean, the theory, the bogus theory that we were fed to justify the austerity measures was that it would enable Greece to pay off its debts. Well, Greece's debt to GDP ratio is pretty much as high as it's ever been. And it remains as true today as it was back in 2015, that there's no realistic prospect of Greece ever paying off its debts. The austerity measures, in fact, were not designed to enable Greece to pay off its debts. What would have helped Greece, if there was any prospect of paying off the enormous debt at all, what would have helped Greece to do that was economic growth. Instead, the austerity measures caused a severe economic contraction and greatly compromised Greece's limited ability to pay off its debt. And by the way, much of that debt was incurred basically to prop up a banking system which had committed fraud on a massive scale.
Of German banks and other international banks, right?
Absolutely. German and French banks were the prime beneficiaries of the bailouts that were foisted upon Greeks. The Greeks were saddled with debts, and the money that was borrowed by Greece was largely used to pay off the French and German banks, which at that point were on the verge of collapse. So this was all just a fraud. When they said that this was designed to help Greece pay off its debt in the long term, no, it was designed to prop up the French and German banks, whose CEOs, frankly, should have been fired or worse, sent off to jail for their grotesque incompetence and their dishonesty. In any event, Greece, the left has been subdued since then. I think it's going to take us a while to recover from this. But none of the problems have been solved. There's one thing that the EU excels at, Youri, and that's kicking the can down the road. That's the only thing they do well. The problem with that strategy is eventually, you can't you run out of road, and there's a cliff in front of you, and then you got to come to terms with the reality of the situation. And I think Europe is approaching that point.
And when it comes to anti-war, anti-imperialist attitudes, is it much more vibrant, much more much more vibrant in Greece compared to other parts of Europe, given Greece's history of imperial meddling into the country?
I would say there's a
so anti-NATO attitudes and people who are mobilizing against the pivot to Asia is a much more existent, however small it might be in Greece, but is a much more vibrant in Greece compared to the rest of the continent of Europe.
Again, I think 2015 was really a turning point. Before then, I would have said yes. I would have answered your question definitively yes. Now, I think it's again the anti-war movement. The opposition to NATO, the opposition to neoliberalism have been greatly subdued since what I call the betrayal in 2015, where Syriza, disregarded the vote of the Greek people in the referendum and imposed austerity on them. But it's still there. The spirit of it hasn't left. And one thing remains true, and that is that in this country, and the polling data bears this out. When you poll Greeks, for example, on how they feel about NATO, how they feel about sending weapons to Ukraine, how they feel about the wisdom of seeking a negotiated peace, they tend to be doves, much more so than pretty much anybody else in Europe right now. But the militancy that we saw 10, 15, 20 years ago isn't there. It's been subdued. I think it'll come back, but it'll take time for us to recover from the trauma of 2015.
Unbelievable, but interesting. And I want now, on to this question. Talk to us about France, because you've now, if I understand your biography correctly from all the interviews and research I've done on you, now you spent time you spent time in France as a lawyer in the late 80s and early 90s, right?
Early 90s. I was there, and then I went back. I was there for 2 or 3 years, living in Paris, working for a Wall Street law firm, which had an office in Paris. And then I came back in the 90s, and I lived in Nice for a year. Because I married a French citizen, and our children were born in France. And of course, I go back to France a lot. I have in-laws there, and so I've gotten to know the country fairly well. Interestingly, I think France is an
and was François Mitterrand of the Socialist Party, was he still the president then, or?
When I arrived, Mitterrand had just been. I think it was just around the time that he was replaced by Chirac.
Okay.
It was either Balladur or Chirac. But at that point in time, those parties, the parties of Chirac and Balladur, were much more progressive than they are today. They were moved sharply to the right by Sarkozy, and even though Macron is not formally part of their parties anymore, what passes for the center right and the center in France has moved sharply to the right. But this reaction, I just want to say, the reaction of the French people to this pension reform has given me a lot of inspiration. They are really worked up. And I would say at this stage that the level of militancy we're seeing in France surpasses, what we're seeing in the rest of Europe, certainly in Greece, by a substantial margin.
Then talk to us about that period in France when you were living there, and the socioeconomics that you think the global left should be fighting for, and then after you answer that, I want you to answer this question, which is: do you think France is a model of liberal democracy or progressive conservatism? And I'm curious. I'm curious your response on that, because Jacques Chirac, and of course we're not going to, and we will talk about France's imperialism in a bit, but Jacques Chirac, when I think of Charles de Gaulle and when I think of Jacques Chirac, yes, they were of the center right, but I don't see them as fire-breathing, flaming right-wingers, if you know what I mean. Like, if ever the term compassionate conservative did exist, or one nation Toryism, or progressive conservatism, which our Canadian audience will find funny because they'll think of Brian Mulroney and John Diefenbaker. But when I think of a compassionate conservative, and somebody who is censor right but is not a fire-breathing right-winger, I think of De Gaulle and Chirac. So I'm curious, your responses to those two questions.
Yeah, I completely agree with your assessment. When I arrived in France, it was still very much the France of Mitterrand's Socialist Party. There were robust social protections, robust pension benefits, very little homelessness, high levels of taxation on the rich, massive amounts of investment in the educational system, in the healthcare system, which was much more accessible to the public. I have to tell you that I came to Paris from New York City at that time, and this is what the United States at that point in time. I mean, I was living in New York City when Bill Clinton was the president. He, of course, had come to power after the Reagan era, and then George W. Bush the elder. So it was a much more neoliberal right-wing environment in New York City than when it came to France. And when I came to France, I really began to appreciate what was possible with a socialist ethos, how much better society was. And Chirac and Balladur, they were whatever their faults may have been, and they had many. They were cognizant of the political sort of orientation and ethos of the French public, and it was a social democratic society, and the French were very, very attached to their social democratic model. But over time, it has been degraded, and we began to see, even when I was living in Paris in the 90s, I began to see the first indications of this. But it really took off, after Sarkozy came to power. That Sarkozy did a lot to undermine the robustness of the social democratic state in France, and then Macron has just taken a wrecking ball to it, or at least tried to. And now we're seeing some serious pushback from the people of France. That's one source of optimism I have. I think they may actually succeed in defeating this so-called pension reform.
That's interesting, my father wanted me to ask this question because I was born in France, and my parents really enjoyed their time in France, and my father was wondering how does Canadian media and politicians depict France, because there's an image of France that they spend way too much on their social programs, and that makes people lazy and stuff like that. And my father was saying, to me, that a lot of German media and politicians and economists, others, from the U.S. often depict France as being way too generous with their social welfare system. And so I'm curious, what's the attitude in Canada? And then I'm curious, Quebec's attitude being the fact that Quebec is a French-speaking province, and Quebec also has a history, like their French forefathers, of going to the streets, of direct action so yeah, and I'm curious if France has a lot of influence on Quebec's social democracy and whatnot.
And it's a very good question. I think English-speaking Canada, it's important to just as you have done, it's important to distinguish between those two societies. There are two societies in Canada even to this very day. English-speaking Canada doesn't really pay a lot of attention to France. I don't think they.
Okay.
There's almost no discussion about French politics in English-speaking Canada. There is what you've said is, I think, very true of the American media and political class, how they view France, right? These people are left-wing, they're socialists, they're extremists, whatever, which is absolutely not true. Certainly not today. But in English-speaking Canada, no. English-speaking Canada is effectively in the thrall of the Anglo-American Empire. What they pay attention to, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Britain. Outside of that, I mean, the rest of the world means nothing to them. I mean, they pay almost no attention to it unless their masters in Washington or London tell them that it's important. In Quebec, however, there is a lot of attention paid to French politics, and I think there's a lot of attachment to the way the French have organized their society. and they share with them, as you suggested, there's a level of militancy in Quebec society that you won't see in the rest of English-speaking Canada. Yeah, it really depends how France is viewed. Really depends what part of Canada you're in, right? So the people in English-speaking Canada pay no attention to France whatsoever, virtually none, and the people in Quebec pay very close attention to what's happening in France and care about it.
That's fascinating. And then talk to us about France. But then that being said, does the Quebec anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movement, and some of the people who are involved in social racial justice, are they in communication a lot with people in France? And I'm curious your response to that. And what is the state of the French anti-imperialist movement and its racial justice movement? Because I know in Quebec, a lot of people in Quebec, complain that that's difficult to talk about racism in Quebec because because racism is viewed as that's an Anglophone problem, but not it's not a Quebec problem. In France, I know a lot of people complain that it's very difficult to talk about institutional racism in France, which does exist. Yes, and I'm curious, is it the same thing when we talk about the anti-war movement in France, and do the two movements ever link up or communicate?
They do, but I think yeah, absolutely. I think there's communication, there's a mutual awareness of what's going on, especially from the Quebec side. The French don't pay that much attention to Quebec, but the Quebecers do pay a significant amount of attention to what's happening in France. Of course, there's racism in Quebec, and there is institutional racism in Quebec. First of all, the degree to which there is racism, I think, depends where you are in Quebec. Quebec is not homogenous. So Montreal, which is the second largest city in Canada, it's where I spend half my year, a very, very diverse city. I think, of all the major Canadian cities, it's the one in which there's the least racism. And there's the most militancy in favor of anti-racist politics. Then you get into sort of the more rural areas of Quebec. I think you'll tend to find, significantly higher levels of white supremacy than you would within Montreal itself. And it's really the government that's currently in power there now, the CAQ, which is
to Quebec, yeah.
the party. It has virtually no support in Montreal. It derives all of its support, virtually all of its support, from outside of Montreal, and it has adopted this law, which is known as Bill 21, which essentially prohibits, people from wearing religious symbols within the civil service or in the public sector. And so there's a perception, and I think this rightly so, that this is really targeting Muslims. I personally,
which I think is very similar to what's been going on in France, what I call the liberal bigotry against the French Muslim population, which wants to practice their
And in fact, law, Bill 21 was, I think you could fairly say, it was inspired by French reform. We'll call it a reform, la loi sur la laïcité. So that's basically, it's a secularism law. That was the way it was pitched to people. So we want to have and look, I'm a big fan of, the separation of church and state. I'm all for the separation of church and state. But I can't imagine what the harm is in allowing people to wear religious symbols in the workplace. I mean, seriously? I think it would be wonderful to actually see a diversity of religious symbols in the workplace, to see people, Jewish persons wearing a yarmulke and women wearing hijabs and Christians wearing. I'm an atheist, by the way. I won't wear any religious symbol. But I love religious diversity. I think we should have a society which fosters that, and obviously we should also make atheists feel welcome, just as welcome as people who have faith in God, or in if they happen to be polytheists, that's fine too. Whatever floats your boat. So I don't see, a permissive environment for religious symbols in the public service as being inconsistent with the separation of church and state. When it becomes problematic is when the state is trying to shove a particular religion down your throat. Allowing people of different religious faiths to wear symbols of their religious belief in the workplace, a diversity of symbols, that's not shoving some particular religion down the throat of the public. And so this is where the confusion has come in, and I think that the people where there's a sort of latent hostility towards Islam, which is really driving all of this. That's why I'm opposed to Bill 21, and that's one of the ways in which France has influenced Quebec society, I think, in a negative way.
Exactly, a negative way.
A lot of Islamophobia in France. None of Islamophobia in France.
But that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is talk to us about France's real role, real negative role in the world. Because I know you're a student, as all of us media critics are, of Chomsky and Chomsky and Herman. And as a media critic, can you apply Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model to France's corporate state press and even that of Greece? And the reason why I ask this is because it's very difficult, to overcome the propaganda that Canada is a force for good in the world. And I think much of the various European countries also have that problem. I think France gets sometimes, look, I'm glad that France didn't join the war in Iraq, but I think sometimes people give France too much credit, and even the French themselves use that as a shield that, like, yes, we're a force for good in the world, when really, when you look at what France does in Africa, what France does in Haiti, that myth, gets completely demolished. Look, and France still does a lot of what NATO does and so forth. So can you apply then Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model to France's corporate state media?
Well, I think you can apply their model to any media ecosystem which is in the hands of the for-profit corporate sector. What they're going to do, and it's been a long time since I read Manufacturing Consent, but what really sort of stayed with me was this idea that there are a series of filters that the corporate media, the management structure of the corporate media establishes, which it's not like they all get in the back room and they say, we're gonna push a particular propaganda sort of a theory out there, and it works in a much more subtle, complex way than that. So one of the ways in which it works is if you're a radical journalist like you or me, they just aren't going to give you a job. Okay, so that's
in France.
Yeah, and I had a very interesting debate in France or anywhere where the corporate media are the predominant form of delivering news to the public. This has become internationalized, this system of filtrage, if I could use the French term. So you sort of filter out the radical points of view, and you only allow the public to hear what the corporatocracy wants you to hear. I had a discussion recently with a Canadian journalist, not a French journalist, about this very subject, and he said to me, he worked for Post Media, which is the largest newspaper publisher in Canada, happens to be controlled by a pro-Trump hedge fund based in the United States. How the Canadian government allowed that to happen is an interesting question, another topic altogether. But nonetheless, he said to me, I know how you view the media in this country. He says, but I never feel any pressure not to write stories about the things that I want to write about. And I said, that's because you're ideologically aligned with the ownership of your employer. So, if I were working in first of all, they'd never give me a job. But if they did give me a job, they'd fire my ass so fast my head would spin if I actually started writing the things that I want to write. They'd either censor me or they'd fire me. The only reason why you don't feel pressure to conform is because you are ideologically aligned with them. And that's one of the reasons why they gave you a job, and why they'll never give, me or Youri Smuter a position in their organization. So this system that, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky described of filtering, the 6 filters, I believe it was, is now pervasive in countries where the media are largely in private hands. France is like that, Canada is like that, the United States is like that. And ultimately, if we want to really be able to inform ourselves, we have to liberate ourselves from the strictures of corporate media. and look outside of the corporate media for the truth, because we're not going to find it there.
And is France's media, is it sort of like Canada in this respect? Because I know now, of course, we can criticize how corporate media in Canada and even the CBC covers, socioeconomic affairs. But Yves says, our good friend Yves Engler, he's talked about how there's been many times about how on domestic issues there still is a bit more space where you can criticize the elites, criticize Canadian capitalism and so forth, but that when it comes to when it comes to foreign policy, that's where it becomes the most restrictive and the most censorious. I know Eve has has often talked about that even if Canadian media is biased against our Indigenous brothers and sisters and their grievances, you can now say in Canada that Canada is a settler colonial country founded on racism and genocide, but you can never ever say, politician or otherwise, that Canadian imperialism is for the benefits of corporations and being a partner in crime to the U.S. empire. And is that like that in France? And before you answer that, I'll just give this example. One of my a family member of mine that's based in France, like he was saying to me that in France, the propaganda system works like this. You can watch endless documentaries on different French corporate state media about American racism or America's negative role in the world, but he says that you will not find endless documentaries about France institutional racism against its black people, against its Muslim population, and you will not find, documentaries in France which is very critical of French imperialism. So I'm curious your response to both of those.
Well, it's hard for me to comment, right, because I haven't lived in France since the 90s. What I recall when I moved to New York City from France in the 90s, a couple of things really struck me about the French media. The one is they were much more aware about international affairs. Absolutely. Like, I mean, I would turn on the television and they would be talking about some country in Africa that I had never seen a mention of in the American media or the Canadian media. And they'd be giving some report upon the current, and it was like, my God, I was learning so much from watching French state-owned media organizations about what was going on in parts of the world that are never discussed in North America. And the other thing is there was, I think, just decidedly more left-wing orientation of the media. That's what I recall then. What the situation is today, I mean, there's been a lot of evolution in the public discourse in France since I was there. I think the country has changed dramatically and for the worse, as have most Western countries. So I don't know. I can't really comment on it. One thing I will say about I think there's some really sort of practical considerations affecting how the media approaches, certainly in Canada, domestic issues and foreign policy issues. Just sort of basic practical realities. And the main one is that, look, most people in Canada can't afford to travel abroad. And if they do travel abroad, they'll do it rarely, and they'll go to other Western countries. They're not going to go to parts of the world that are troubled. Most people in Canada, so let's take the case of Ukraine, which is obviously the most troubled country in Europe right now, and the focus of so much attention. I would say probably 98% of Canadians have never been to Ukraine and never will be to Ukraine in their entire lives. They certainly they can't afford to go there, and if they can't afford to travel abroad, they're going to go somewhere else for a relaxed, cushy vacation. So what does this do? This creates for the media an opportunity to misrepresent the reality of what's happening there, because you'll never actually, they know the vast majority of Canadians will never go there and see with their own eyes what's happening. They'll never go to a country like Ukraine or some country in Africa or some country in the Middle East, which is, being ravaged by Western imperialism, and talk to the people there and hear with their own ears what those people are experiencing, see with their own eyes what is being done to the country. And so this gives them tremendous latitude to lie with complete impunity. That's why there's so much propaganda about foreign policy in Western media, particularly in Canada and the United States, At least in France, I think one of the reasons why France, again, I'm speculating, but my guess is one of the reasons why the French media tend to pay much closer attention to what is going on in Africa, and particularly Northern Africa, is because of the geographical proximity of these countries. It's very easy for somebody from France to take a ship from Marseille to Alger in Algeria, or go visit Tunisia or Morocco. That's a much easier thing for them to do, or somebody to fly from Canada to do that. So this gives the media less latitude to misrepresent what's happening in these, non-Western countries. That's why we see so much dishonesty about foreign policy. They can get away with murder, and they do every day, literally every day. Like what we're being told about Ukraine and the war right now in Canada is you couldn't be further away from the truth. It's just a set of non-stop, bald-faced, audacious lies that almost nobody is questioning or willing to even attempt to question. And a big part of the reason why that happens, and it can happen, is because the vast majority of Canadians never been to Ukraine and never will be.
That's interesting, and I think what needs to happen, though, I think it seems as if everywhere we need to stop. I think we need to, we need to, question our history. I like what the phrase Alfred Desai says, that we're swimming in an ocean of lies. We have fake news, we have fake history, fake education, so forth. And I think France is a country that's not immune for that. I know somebody once said to me that they think that the anti-racism movement is much better in the U.S., and even conversations is much better in the U.S. compared to France, where people say, oh, no, that's just that's just an American thing. And so that's why I was asking if you know anything about the state of the anti-war movement and the racial justice movement in France, or has anyone in Quebec been reporting on that, given given that France, you'll find this, a lot of the problems that that we complain about of Canada and the U.S., you can find that also in France.
Yeah, I think to the extent you see any coverage about France in Canada right now, it's mostly focused on the pension reform, and because this has gotten, understandably, the French public very worked up. But around the issue of racism in France, which is a very, very serious issue.
Police brutality as well, yeah.
That gets almost zero coverage in not just the Canadian media, North American media, almost zero coverage.
Well, here's hoping. Here's hoping that I think in the end of the day, I think we all need to sort of go back to the drawing board and start to decolonize our mind. But then, sort of in closing, because you're a radical, you're an eco-socialist. I'm definitely also I'm of various far left, schools of thought, and I consider that a compliment, not a, not a denouncement. But what if France? I mean, like, if you were to give a political science class, would you describe France as a liberal, as a model of liberal democracy, but we should still be fighting for more leftism, and that people like de Gaulle and Chirac, that's that they're that rare breed of like progressive conservatism or compassionate conservatism? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I think that France is one of the, how shall I put this? It is one of the most aggressive states in terms of today. I'm talking about the current reality, in promoting, a neoliberal dogma and imposing neoliberal policies upon the population. Some of the vestiges of the socialist France of the François Mitterrand era are still there. They've survived because they're so popular, because they're so deeply embedded in, in French society. And, this pension reform, I think, is a really sort of powerful example of that. How, compared to most other countries, France's pension laws are extremely favorable, right? But that's only because the pension laws in so many other countries have been degraded aggressively over time. The French have fought tooth and nail to keep many of the benefits that the era of socialism under the Mitterrand Socialist Party, developed for the French people. I mean, I often talk to my wife, who was born and raised in the France of François Mitterrand, and she speaks very affectionately about it. She tells me some of the things, the advantages they had as kids growing up that are unthinkable today. So France is
For
unfortunately,
example, for example.
like, everything was free. All the social benefits were free. The education was free. Music lessons were free. The healthcare system, everything was free. You could easily get access to a doctor on short notice who would give you, care of the highest caliber. The streets were cleaner. There was far less homelessness. There was much more militancy in the society. And that was accepted. That was considered a wonderful thing. There was a much more discussion in the public discourse about oppression, about the impacts of imperialistic foreign policy on the developing world. Just a broad range. She speaks very affectionately, and then when I hear her talking about that, I think, wow, what a wonderful country France used to be. Even when I was living there in the 90s, I mean, it was a much more impressive society. So I think France, like all Western countries, has become increasingly neoliberal, and I think it bears little, and frankly, it's become much more Americanized than it used to be. Like, American culture is now pervasive. What we call culture, it's not really culture, it's propaganda masquerading as culture, is now pervasive in France. When I was there, it was like you'd see people, farmers and ordinary citizens, would be protesting about a McDonald's opening up. Now because they wanted to protect French cuisine and the art of, of French cuisine, and all sorts of things like that, which now have just sort of been overwhelmed by, Americanized institutions and neoliberal dogma, and I'm hoping that this fight over, I think the fact that Macron's party did not manage to secure a majority in the last election is a positive sign. That's opened up a space for effective resistance, amongst the French populace to the neoliberal agenda. And I'm hoping that, if they can defeat this pension reform, that will be a stepping stone to, turning back the tide of neoliberalism in France. But it's definitely been heading in the wrong direction ever since, the time that Sarkozy came to power.
And what can a lot of times, the left, in the U.S. and elsewhere, it gets very disoriented, and there's always the question, what can we do? What should we do? What's in terms of France? Do you think the global left, mostly the Western left, could learn from France when it comes to protesting like hell and fighting like hell? That even if, heaven forbid, some neoliberal voodoo economic policy gets passed, we at least have to put up a goddamn fight and not just let it happen. So what of the French left militancy do you think Canada, the UK, the US, and elsewhere can learn from France?
Well, I draw a distinction between disruptive protest and polite protest. Polite protest, in my opinion, is absolutely useless. These protests where you go out and you tell the cops in advance where you're going to be, and they say, okay, we want you to go down, tell us what route you're going to take, and we'll close off the traffic, and you've got 2 or 3 hours, and you can do your speeches at this square, and it's all nicely organized and coordinated with police, and it causes minimal disruption to the capitalist class. I hate to say this, and I know people are going to disagree with me, but I think those types of protests, and I participated in many of them, far too many to recount, are absolutely useless. The elites just don't care. They don't care. In fact, they like those protests because those protests allow them to propagate the myth that there is, free speech in our society and political diversity. The protests that we should be engaging in are the ones that cause disruption. Economic disruption, general strikes, shutting down large sectors of major cities, shutting down industries. One of as you probably know, Youri, one of my favorite forms of protest is when some loudmouth hack of a politician is standing in front of a microphone spewing out lies.
Break.
Interrupt them and to shower them with truth bombs. and embarrass them and humiliate them. I think we need to get to the point where every time a politician, a political candidate, or a sitting office holder gets in front of a microphone, that they're actually afraid to speak, because they're thinking, who is going to stand up and embarrass me today? Who's going to call me out on my bullshit lies today? They have to have, not talking about violence. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about humiliation, about being exposed as liars. They have to have the fear of that in them every time they take to a podium and try to address the public. Disruption and I think this is one of the lessons that I learned from, my time in France back in the 1990s, my time in Greece during the opposition to austerity. Disruptive protest is the only effective form of protest. Polite protest is useless, absolutely useless. You have to hurt them in the pocketbook. You have to hurt them reputationally. If you aren't going to put the hurt on them, you may as well stay home.
Exactly. Well, I think that's probably a very good place to end our conversation. I could talk to you for hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. But we're going to definitely. But no, this is definitely a very good conversation. I definitely want to explore more France and so forth. And of course, if you know any French leftists that would like to come on the program to myth bust France when it comes to institutional racism and France's role in imperialism, open invite to all of them. And I want to suggest people also should check out the work of Yasser Louazi, who has been on Democracy Now!, the Real News several times. And I'm going to make sure that link to his work in case people want some French myth busting. But until then, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with one of my favorite peoples, Dimitri Lascaris, independent journalist, former Real News correspondent on environmental affairs in Canada, member and co-founder of Green Left Canada, a member of Disruption Canada, environmentalist, anti-imperialist, social equal justice campaigner and lawyer. And also, yes, he was also, how can we forget? He was also a former Green Party leadership candidate, and he almost won. In that one, in that wonderful campaign. And so, Dimitri, thank you so much for joining us today, and looking forward to having you back on in the future.
Thank you, Youri. Nice talking to you.